All right, welcome football fans to a Tuesday episode of the Call Sheet Daily Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Smith, here at the Fans First Sports Network. Today, diving into what I think is a fascinating subject that has major ramifications for the future of football, at least at the collegiate level. And it may be a little bit nerdy in terms of the detail, but I think it's really interesting because it's indicative of a broader trend in American society. The topic is the House versus NCAA ruling that was handed down in district court last week that essentially upholds an injunction filed in court back in 2021 by two collegiate athletes who were asking for NCAA member schools to pay students a bigger share, or actually, I shouldn't even say a bigger share, but a share of their collective bargaining and revenue rights that they get from TV contracts and the money that they make on the name, image, and likeness of young athletes. So to put that all into really simple phrasing, the court ruled last week that colleges can now pay their student athletes. And we'll get into the details of that ruling in a minute. But it is going to have a seismic effect on the collegiate landscape. And to try to gain some, I think, bigger picture idea as to what this effect may be, let's go back to 1907. All right, 1907. This is the history nerd in me, the teacher in me. But I think this is a really valuable and appropriate lesson. In 1907, Congress passed an act called the Tillman Act. And what the Tillman Act did was it prohibited corporations and labor unions from donating money to political campaigns. Why 1907? Because by 1907, America is firmly feeling the effects of the Industrial Revolution. Reconstruction after the Civil War has changed the nature of the American economy. The old agrarian economy has sort of gone by the wayside, and the factory movement has kicked in. America has built railroads all over the country, shipping goods from the production point to a selling point, whether that be a bigger market, a city, or a port, has become very easy because of the railroad. And industrialization has conquered the country, and the American economy is booming as a result. Well, that industrialization has created massive trusts, which are today known better as corporations. And those trusts, in attempts to influence the political process on their behalf, have begun to donate huge sums of money to political campaigns. And in response, labor unions, which are essentially negotiating against those trusts, have begun to do the same thing. So Republicans who have kind of planted their flag on the side of big business are now advocating for free markets and corporate rights, while labor unions who have aligned themselves with the Democrats are advocating for workers' rights and wages and things of that nature. And in steps Congress, and Congress says the impact of this money can be nothing but corrupting. We don't see any way in which large sums of money coming from private interests going directly to politicians will not lead to corruption. And so they passed the Tillman Act, and it prohibits corporations and labor unions from donating that money. And it allows for the donation of money, but only from small private donors with capped sums. You can donate up to X number of dollars as a private citizen. And that was the law of the land for a long time. But as political campaigns became bigger, as television was introduced to American society and the importance of advertising through the medium of TV and elsewhere became more and more important, political parties began to look for ways to raise more money. And in 1975, they found their answer because in 1975, Congress passed Public Law number 93-625, which tried to clarify some of the changes that were being proposed to the way that political campaigns were being funded. And there was a section of that law, Section 527 of the Internal Revenue Code, that essentially stated that if these private donations were not being given to candidates directly, that they could be permissible. That while corporations and labor unions and private entities couldn't donate money directly to campaigns, they could create third parties, so to speak. They could create separate institutions that could raise money with the hopes of influencing campaigns. And those groups became known as 527 groups. They were named after the specific section of that public law. And today they are better known as political action committees, and they raise unlimited sums of money. It's a crazy system. As an individual, I am still not allowed, under the restrictions of the existing law, to, for example, buy a politician a meal. I can't take him to Applebee's and buy him a crappy bourbon steak, because if I spend more than $20 on that politician directly, that's deemed an illegal gift. But I can form a political action committee and I can charge wealthy donors $10,000 a plate just to attend it. And I can then raise hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, and use that money on the behalf of that candidate. That candidate who I can't buy a $20 meal for directly, I can spend unlimited sums of money indirectly to elect that individual. In 2010, the Supreme Court eliminated caps that had been in existence for over a century, paving the way for these unlimited donations. And the result has been staggering. In the 2024 election, the Joe Biden / Kamala Harris campaigns raised and spent approximately $1.4 billion on their failed presidential campaign, while Donald Trump and the Republicans, specifically the Trump campaign, spent about $1.1 billion to get elected. As far as single donors were concerned, Timothy Mellon, that name should sound familiar, the banking heir of the famous Mellon family, 82 years old, donated $197 million to Donald Trump and the Republicans. One individual, $197 million. Elon Musk donated somewhere in the neighborhood of $177 million. On the Democratic side, Michael Bloomberg donated $93 million. George Soros, about $66 million. The amount of money coming in from private donors is staggering. And the effect, while nobody can prove corruption, to prove corruption, you have to have smoking gun type evidence. You got to have the email. Here, Mr. Mellon, thank you for the millions of dollars you gave me. Here is the legislation that you have asked that we pass. That stuff doesn't exist, obviously. But to not believe that corruption exists as a result of the money in the process is silly. It exists. Which brings us to House versus NCAA. Just as political campaigns are no longer what they used to be, just as the money has changed them, the money that will now be coming into the collegiate system will clearly alter college sports as we know them. Again, the lawsuit was brought in 2021, specifically by a swimmer at Arizona State University named Grant House and a basketball player at TCU named Sedona Prince. And they sought an injunction that would force the NCAA to lift restrictions on revenue sharing from its broadcast rights. And the NCAA agreed to a $2.75 billion settlement, which was upheld in court last week. And that's going to create a revenue sharing model whereby NCAA member schools are now going to be able to distribute their funds directly to Division I athletes. In particular, they'll be able to spend about $20.5 million a year. That represents 22% of the revenue from things like media rights and ticket sales and sponsorships, et cetera. And so, the pushback against this has been the following. For a long time, people have argued, yeah, but like these athletes are compensated. They get athletic scholarships. The NCAA member schools distribute about $4 billion every year in scholarships. But the athletes have long argued that number should not offset the other millions of dollars in revenue that they, the athletes, help produce for the schools. So while for decades student athletes had the cost of their attendance covered, they were unable to profit from their name, image, and likeness. In 2021, the NCAA cleared the way for athletes to do that with their NIL settlements. And now under House, the schools will be able to pay them directly. All right, what possible issues, what possible problems do we see with this? Well, let's start with football because this is going to be the driver of it all. If a school can pay all of its athletes under scholarship up to about $20 million per year, where do you think most of that money is going? It's going to football players. Why? Because football is the cash cow. In almost every major athletic program in the country, football is the revenue source that makes money for the college and in many instances funds other athletic programs that operate at a loss. I mean, volleyball and tennis and golf. I mean, those sports don't make money for colleges. And now when you have these massive conference mergers, West Coast schools like Oregon and USC joining the Big Ten and having to fly across the country to play Penn State in volleyball in front of an audience of a couple hundred people. That is not making money for the institution. That is losing money. How do they fund those programs? Football. So now, if your school has $20 million in revenue it can spend on its athletes, and you have a star quarterback, you've got an Arch Manning type quarterback like you do at the University of Texas, don't you think you better spend a big chunk of that money on your Arch Manning type quarterback? I don't know if Texas is going to need to spend it on Arch Manning directly. I mean, the Manning family is pretty well off, but there will be lots of examples of future rock star quarterbacks on campus who will essentially say to the university, I want a big chunk of that revenue sharing money. And if you don't give it to me, I guarantee I'll find a rival school who will. So what's going to happen now when these big schools, these football powerhouses, the Alabamas and Georgias and Texas and Ohio State and Michigan, et cetera, when they spend 80% of their revenue sharing money on the athletes, are other student athletes going to sue and claim that this is unfair in some way? We have Title IX legislation still on the books. If women athletes are not funded in some way that makes it competitive with their male counterparts, is that going to open up lawsuits? What about the number 20.5 million? That currently represents 22% of the revenue from things like media rights and sponsorships and ticket sales, et cetera. How did they arrive at that number? That feels very arbitrary. Will there be lawsuits that will challenge that number to be raised? Will student athletes now, because they're being paid, get more aggressive in hiring agents? Will that be deemed that once you hire an agent now, your amateur status is over? But is that going to be challenged? Will we now see student athletes go to court and say, I am making millions in NIL money. I now stand to make additional millions in revenue sharing money directly from my school. I need an agent to negotiate this. At what point will the courts overturn that? And at what point will powerhouse schools who can afford to pay the stars who dramatically affect the outcome of games, who swing the balance of power, or probably more likely keep the balance of power in the hands of the Georgias, Alabamas, Texases, Ohio States, Michigans, etc. At what point will those schools say, what are we doing in a conference with Illinois and Purdue and Northwestern? Why do I need to be playing in a conference with Mississippi State and Rice? Why don't we break off and start our own thing? Do we need the NCAA anymore? I mean, yes, there is this conversation about now having the money that we pay our students via the revenue sharing, et cetera. Can't we do that on our own? The SEC has already talked about this. The SEC has already talked about its unhappiness with the way the NCAA allocates teams into its playoff system. We have a 12-team playoff now. Some people think we'll go to a 16-team playoff soon. The SEC has lobbied for a new structure that will determine who gets into that playoff. They believe they need more guaranteed spots in the playoff. If they don't get it, will they now essentially say to some of the other powerhouse schools, let's go create our own super conference? The 40 best schools in the country, the 40 most well-funded schools in the country, and create our own league and our own super playoff and our own champion. You can absolutely see this ruling, House versus NCAA, creating lawsuits galore. I mean, my goodness gracious, you're talking about $20.5 million new dollars being funneled to student athletes in a way that doesn't really give the schools parameters or direction. Allocate it as you wish. What could go wrong there? I can't see that becoming an issue at all, right? And I think long term, the effect of this is it changes the nature of college sports as we know it. I think we are headed towards a separation whereby the haves really become more powerful, man, where they really concentrate their power. We've seen it in politics already. When Timothy Mellon can donate $197 million individually, it ain't out of the goodness of his heart. What's he getting in return for that? You know that happens on both sides of the political aisle. The wealthy donors shape the policy. Well, as we look at the effects of the House ruling down the road, I think without question, it's going to allow the powerhouse programs to continue to consolidate power in their own hands and ultimately probably to break away and create their own entity. And I don't know if it's good or bad. I really don't. I think we'd have to wait and see. I just think it's inevitable. The times they are changing, said Bob Dylan, and that is absolutely correct, particularly on the collegiate athletic landscape and in the world of football. So for good or for bad, House versus NCAA, it's going to have a huge effect. All right, that's our Tuesday show. Join me tomorrow. Tomorrow, it is Vince Lombardi's birthday, the legendary Vince Lombardi, for whom the Super Bowl trophy is named after. And on our Whiteboard Wednesday show, we're going to break down Vince Lombardi's signature play, power sweep. Vince Lombardi's power sweep, which he rode to about 9 NFL championships with the Green Bay Packers. We'll break that down on Whiteboard Wednesday. So join me for that. Until then, have a great day, everybody.